It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in. It's the Take Command podcast. Craig Hoffman sitting in my usual chair. Logan Paulsen, very much not. He's in Mobile, Alabama for the Senior Bowl. Logan, how is Mobile? One of my favorite stops on the NFL calendar.
I definitely enjoy the Senior Bowl. It's one of the funnest things because you get really good access. There's a lot of other media people down here, and it's not like big media. It's like draft media, and so everyone's usually pretty accommodating with their time. And again, because Mobile is a small town, you kind of run into coaches that and front office people that So I really enjoy this event, probably a little bit more than the draft. The draft is more lights and glitz and all that kind of stuff. This is just more. It's more personal, and I enjoy that. And I also think it's more fun to watch football as opposed to watch someone run a 40.
Yeah, that's what I loved about Mobile. The access is great. Everyone seems to be in a pretty good mood. It's a good time down there. That's probably the thing I miss the most of travel, but hopefully we'll be on the road again for the Combine here in a month, which I can't believe it's in a month, but that's crazy. That's where we're at. That's what happens when you play deep into the calendar. So today on the show, we're going to quickly do a film review. We're not going to go a full film review of the NFC Championship game because frankly, nobody wants that. And it's not nearly as relevant to to really anything. Like that team that took the field will never take the field as is again. But there are some things to learn. So we'll pull those out here in the next 15 minutes or so. But then we're going to take a look at the biggest roster needs for Washington this offseason and how the two avenues to fill them are shaping up to actually do so. So what's the contour of the free agent class? And then what's the contour of this draft class, and how does that match up with Washington's needs? So without further ado, let's start off with the offense, Logan, who, outside of the fumbles, which obviously for the actual impact in the game was pretty important, but outside of the fumbles, I feel like actually had a pretty good day. Like Jaden, I think really proved himself in this game again, that this is who he is, that he can play all different kinds of games. I think the biggest gripe, if you will, is that they just could not find explosives in this game. But that also we knew would be a challenge because Philly's the best explosive defense in terms of not giving it up in the NFL. What stood out for you when you watched the offense live and then went back and watched it on tape?
Yeah, it was pretty much just like all the things that were really positive in the second matchup this year just weren't on the table. And again, that's just a testament to Philly and how they played defense and their ability to create pressure with four. They did blitz a little bit. But their man coverage stuff was great. Their zone coverage stuff was great. It's just a bunch of tight window throws that are really hard for Jaden to manage. And I think the fact that he did manage them and he was super efficient and he was throwing through tight windows, he didn't take a bunch of sacks, I thought was a testament to him. And I love the plan that they came in with. I think, one of the things we talked about on the preview show was that they have a hard time, versus man coverage because they don't have a lot of people that are really great separators versus man. And then it's like, well, Zach's really good at that versus if the matchup's right. And so we're going to throw the ball to Zach a ton, and Zach's just going to deliver down in and down out, and Jaden's going to be there with him making nice tight window throws. And so I really like the plan. I like some of the run stuff they did. I like the traps and whams, how they got the I said traps and whams because I'm just so used to it. I like the wham stuff that they did, with Bates, and I like that B-Rob got a couple of those. And you could see that if they were possessing the football more, that would have been a bigger part of it. But I do think that, and we talked about this on the, kind of immediate reaction show, it was going to be tough. And if you can't find explosive plays, it's going to be really tough. And that's just what it felt like. Every down was just a hard down. There was no easy downs. Every run was tough. Every short completion was tough. There was high risk in terms of them getting pressure. So, I came away after watching the film really impressed that they handled it so well, and that Jaden specifically handled it so well. But it was a slog a little bit for the offense, and that's what happens when you play a defense like Philly.
For sure, and I think my one thing that I still wish they had just found a way to turn this dial up a little bit was moving Terry around a little bit more. And I know that in part he was so heavily on the left because they started getting in their faster tempo sooner.
Sure.
So it's not fair to just be like, oh, they reverted back because they did move him around a little bit. His touchdown's coming from the right side, right? On that slant route against Darius Slay. They get him away from Kenyon Mitchell, but they definitely did not get Terry as involved or involved as much. And then part of that is, as we said later in the game, they're in their fastest version of tempo where the receivers are not moving around at all because it takes too much time to run across the field, and they're trying to come back in that game. But I definitely wish they could have gotten Terry a little bit more involved. But to your point, like Zach, 16 targets, 11 catches. And frankly, like Zach played even better than that. Jaden actually missed a couple of throws. The very few throws that he missed, he missed Zach a couple times. So this is part of what we're going to talk about later on in the show of how you improve this team is finding ways to like build a team that can beat Philly. Yeah. And I know that's like kind of crazy to think about just doing it against one team, but like if you're in the AFC, you have to build a team that can beat the Chiefs, and nobody's figured out how to do it yet.
It's what Buffalo does with the Chiefs, right? Every offseason, right. All their media is talking about is how you beat the Chiefs. And so I'm not saying we're in the same boat. I don't think Philly's in the same boat as Kansas City, but right now, like that's like them. And Detroit too. I'll give Detroit the same kind of look. It's just that they're the way they've constructed their team is they're hard to beat. They beat everybody, right? And so what elements of that roster do we need to add to this roster to make sure that we're consistently competitive and we're not kind of walking that razor's edge of, like we got to be really lucky on fourth down. We got to be really lucky in terms of third down conversions. And luck is maybe the wrong word, but we got to kind of ride that variance.
You have to be unreasonably good.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge, and we can talk about that more in depth as we go. Defensively, I think the bugaboo was clearly one of the ones that they had, or the two ones that they kind of had all year. It's got to have it situations on the outside where like the 4th and 5, they're able to get the big conversion to AJ Brown, and then obviously the run defense, starting with that first run. And I got to say, Logan, I talked about this a little bit on the radio show the other day. That first Saquon run is so disappointing to watch because it's so uncharacteristic of who they've been all year. And some folks are immediately like, well, they've given up big runs to Saquon. They've given up big runs to a lot of people. That's who they've been. But like, typically it's not because there's not the hustle and the finish, and it's just like a bad run fit. But guys are flying to the ball and they just miss their responsibility. On that play, it starts with Fowler, who just does not play a technique that is taught, the old spinorama in slow motion, and then he winds up tripping up multiple guys. And that also allows Jordan Mailata to get out on Noah Igbenogany and just shuck him into that pile. There's it's funny if you're not a Commanders fan, clip of Jordan Mailata mic'd up, and he is talking to AJ Brown, and he's like, sorry, in his Australian accent, sorry, bro, because he just chucks AJ Brown, or like he kind of sees 4 Commanders and AJ Brown, and he just chucks Noah into the pile. He's like, sorry, man, I saw I could cause a pile up, and I did. And then obviously Quan and Chin, it's really hard to tackle Saquon Barkley, but you'd hope that they do better. And then I think the thing that's a real bummer is like you look at the backside and a guy like Frankie, who is just hustles his face off at all times. And this is the first play of the game. And if he had just run to the ball, he can probably clean up the missed tackles. And instead, he assumes that either one of the safeties or the sideline is going to take care of it. And then he starts running when it's way too late, and Saquon goes for 60. And I think that's the thing that's disappointing is, again, the Eagles deserve to win, better team, whole deal. But the fact that Washington on offense with the turnovers and then stuff like this on defense just didn't give themselves a chance is what I think stings and what will burn all offseason for the folks that are coming back.
Yeah, no, I think that was a very frustrating down to watch, obviously for the reasons you just laid out. And, could Frankie have made the tackle? I don't know. But when I'm coaching at the high school level, when I'm advising guys in the NFL, like one of the things I'm really big on with defensive guys is like, dude, just run to the ball. Like run as fast as you can to the ball. Excuse me. Don't slow down. No breaks. If they blow the whistle before you get there, it's okay. There's a lot of snaps in the game, and if you're a rotational guy, but just like a bat out of hell, run to the ball. And when I was in college, when I was in the NFL, every team that I've worked with was like, man, let's make sure that we're running the ball. And so that's one there where it's like, are you going to make the tackle? I don't know. You know what I mean? I have no idea if you're going to make the tackle. Like he might be faster than you by a lot, and he is pretty fast, but just put that effort on tape, I think is what I would say, and make sure that you're putting the best version of yourself forward. And again, that's not a knock on Frankie Luvu's game throughout, because I thought he did some really just dynamic things. But again, on that play, if you're writing notes for him, you say, hey, like, let's make sure we finish here. And I think that that's a totally reasonable expectation. And who knows if he makes the play, but again, like that's one of those things that was really kind of not in line with the team. You know what I mean? Not in line with who they are. And I think that's the more frustrating thing is they didn't tackle well and they didn't do their job, right? And Deontay Fowler kind of spinning out because there's one Dorrance Armstrong has later where you see the correct technique. You're supposed to penetrate up the field and it cleans up the pursuit angles for guys and it makes the back bow. And we're not doing what we're supposed to do. And so not running the ball, not tackling well, not being assignment sound, like this team is at their best when they are those three things, and they just didn't do that on that play. And so it is frustrating that the very first opportunity you have to kind of respond to this Philly team is that play.
For sure. What else stood out to you on tape, whether it's defense or defensive line and how they played the run and that part of it, or pass rush or something on the back end?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was with the front, because I was really kind of, it feels like that they just got their butts kicked, you know what I mean? But I think this is like the classic Philly run game. It's like you're watching plays, you're like, that's pretty good by John right there. Or Carl Davis, nice job playing over the top here. Or, hey, great job by Frankie squeezing and hitting this puller and making this a tough look. And then you get to the 5 explosives and you're like, damn, this isn't good. Like guys are getting blown off the ball on a double team. Like guys are, they're not getting off blocks. And again, they're in my mind, I'm like, is there a reasonable expectation that they could make this play? And sometimes the answer is no. Like, for example, on the Jalen Hurts run, when there's 5 offensive linemen plus the running back, you have 6 in the box, and you've walked Bobby Wagner out over the slot player because you're worried about the RPO. It's 6 on 6, and there's a free player in Jalen Hurts, and the double team kills the front side defensive tackle. Saquon gets a piece of the backside player, which I think is Frankie. And that's a really tough down for the defense. And that's one of those things where you look at it and you say, man, on paper, this is going to be hard. We need to be elevated by the personnel. And I think that's what we're talking about when you say, how can the roster get better, is moments like that, where it's like, hey, if we have a more disruptive defensive tackle and linebacker, whatever, this scheme becomes a little bit easier to manage, if that makes sense. While we're not in a good number situation here to stop the run, because, it's 4 wide receivers, there's a back in the backfield, we're thinking pass, we're defending the pass. Can we get a more disruptive player at one of those spots to make this a little bit easier for us to manage? And so, again, those are the types of moments you look at and you're like, damn, that's a tough down. Obviously, the first play of the game. A couple of touchdowns were hard to me because I'm like, we got guys not in they're in their gaps, but they're peeking inside. And one of the things about Saquon is he's so explosive laterally, right? Kind of to bounce the run. You got to make sure you stay home and trust that the inside players are going to make the play. And I know that can be really hard, especially in a game in the NFC Championship game. You want to make a play, you want to show up for your team, and but you got to do what you got to do your job too. And I think there was a couple plays like that where you're like, man, they're over trying to make a play, and it leads to some negative defensive plays and explosive plays for Philadelphia.
Yeah, I remember, I'm trying to think of who it was. It might have been Jason Kelsey saying he was watching training camp this year. Obviously, he retired now. But it was someone in the Philly orbit talking about Saquon and seeing him in training camp for the first time. Actually, no, I think it was Darius Slay was on a podcast. That's who I think it was. And he was like, man, watching Saquon in training camp, I was like, oh. I always knew he was great, but getting to see it that often up close and watching how he will take a run that's designed to go in the A gap and get from A to B to C to D, in terms of his lateral quickness and his ability to bounce a run that decisively, that quickly. And he's behind our offensive line, that dude's going to run for 2,000 yards. And sure enough, that's literally what he did. But that's the thing. And you see it on the Frankie Louvu, or Frankie has this happen to him on the second touchdown run, Saquon's second carry of the day. Frankie's there. He's in the hole. He's where he's supposed to be. And then Saquon bounces out, and everyone else is peeking inside, like you said. And Saquon's ability to go from dead in the water, 3-yard loss, when Frankie Louvu tackles, I don't know, 25 other backs in the league, if not 30, for a loss. Mm-hmm. And Saquon's ability to not even let Frankie get a finger on him and get from A gap to outside to the pylon, that is just super special. And that's what that type of talent does. And that's going to lead us pretty efficiently here after, Logan, you make your final point into how the Commanders acquire some more special talent.
Yeah, and again, like we're going to double click on this here in 1 second, but to me, it just shows you like, hey, like when you want to play these light box structures that Joe, because again, when you're in plus box structures, like the guys played pretty good. You know, obviously there's a couple here and there where you're not doing great, but how do you do a version, if you want to be a light box structure team in terms of defending the run, how do you do what Philly does? And I'm not a great defensive mind, but I say like, you know, what's really helpful is having Jalen Carter in there, or having Milton Williams, or having Jordan Davis, guys that can be disruptive and play a gap and a half in that front and let the linebackers be free to like run and make plays downhill. So that I know like that doesn't seem like the easiest solution because it's hard to find guys like that, but that after watching it, you're like, man, if you could get that piece in there that's just a little bit more disruptive, a little bit like that agent of chaos in terms of splitting double teams. And again, like I'm going to be really honest here. Like there were times where John Allen was that guy. He did a great job kind of swimming back blocks and getting penetration in the backfield probably 4 or 5 times in this game. But can we get more of that from more elements of that front?
And it feels like it's worth mentioning Deron Payne was out in this game. Johnny Newton's a rookie. You hope that he can develop into that guy. But it's also worth mentioning that if you look at the final 4 teams in the league, they all have that guy.
Yeah.
And Chris Jones in Kansas City, Ed Oliver in Buffalo, Jalen Carter in Philadelphia, interior linemen, offensive and defense. There are some folks in the league who think that they're now more valuable than exterior guys. Like that they would rather have a dominant 3-tech than a dominant defensive end. So
well, if you think about like the way you can create pressure up the middle of a defense, like it makes sense. And
totally.
Again, and I think it's changed with guys like Aaron Donald, with guys like Chris Jones, really kind of showing how devastating that person can be. A guy that can push the pocket, but also you can put him on like what you call the fish, like the weakest link on the offensive line, one of 5, and let him rush and create a win consistently. And like Chris Jones is a big guy. He's like 330 pounds. He's 6'6", and you wouldn't think he'd be able to rush from the perimeter, but having that guy that just got that you can just win in those big moments is so incredibly important.
Take Command Podcast, Craig Hoffman, Logan Paulsen. Logan, it is officially the offseason, sadly. So now we get the great fun of looking how the Commanders are going to improve this roster. And I think that there are a lot of spots that obviously can improve. But if you think about like your wish list, you're writing Santa Claus Adam Peters here, and you're like, hey, Santa Adam, I want some new players. What do you think that your list would look like? And what do you think that Adam, who's down there in Mobile with you, obviously, well, not with you, he's also in Mobile doing his job as you are in Mobile doing yours. What do you think that he's really looking for looking for this offseason?
Yeah, I'm not going to project what I think Adam wants because, you know, he's way more ahead of the process than me, right? He's going to talk to Dan. He's going to talk to the position coaches. He's going to talk to director of college scouting and figure out like the best, like what's available in the draft, what's available in free agency. He's going to talk to the pro scouting director.
And real quick, like they've been doing that for years.
Yes.
For this class. Like it's important to point out that on their process, like they have guys that already know the 2026 draft class and probably some contour of the 27. They know who's going to be a free agent in 26 and 27. And since 2024, since they got here, they've had certain things possibly circled for this year's classes. So when we do what we're going to do next, which is take a look at those classes, this is something that they've been years ahead on. And maybe Adam and some of the people more towards the top were more focused on the here and now, and they're just now getting caught up by those people. But those things have been happening in parts of the Commanders front office for ever since this front office was put together.
Yeah, like, you know, I just thinking about Adam and what he's doing right now. First off, he's managing the team through the season. Then he's coming down here. He's watching so he's evaluating the conclusion of this year, right? Kind of putting a bow on this year. But he's also thinking forward. He's got to have a really good grasp, and I know he does, just from being with him in San Francisco and talking with him briefly. Like, he's got a great grasp of the free agency class. He's got a great grasp of the draft class. And it just, the amount of information that position has to digest every single day, seemingly, is just, it's insane. So, like, you know, people talk about, like, making your own luck and kind of how was he so good in his first year? I mean, his staff must be tremendous to be able to distill all this information down and get where you need to go. So I'm not going to, again, they're way ahead of me in terms of this process. But for me, when I'm looking at the roster, I look at this and I say to myself, like, always offensive line talent. That's like, I don't know if that's number one, but it's definitely in the list, right? It could be number two, number three, but offensive line talent. And it doesn't need to be a starter, but we need offensive line depth. I need a developmental piece, right? I look at Philly, I look at Detroit, I look at even Tampa Bay to a certain extent. Like, they're always drafting offensive line to eventually fill out when guys leave, to be in there for injury. And if there's somebody in this draft class, we can talk about a couple names if you want. This offensive line class this year is kind of weak in the draft. And traditionally, it's hard to find guys in free agency. And I haven't really looked at the free agency list yet. But even if you take a guy like Anthony Belton from NC State, he's a big fella, he's tackle guard kind of guy. He might not be ready this year, but you look at the physical profile and you say, that's going to make this group better just in terms of physicality, size, speed, weight. If you have a coach you feel like that can develop him. And again, I just think even if he's not starting for you this year, like adding talent to that group is so important. And that's a group in terms of the guys that played here this year that I have the utmost respect for. I love what they did. I love how they competed. I love how they fought. So this is not an indictment of those 5 guys, but I'm just saying, if I put my GM hat on, like, what are some things that I think need to get better? I want more talent on the offensive line. So that's that's in the list somewhere.
I would say both lines, but we'll start on the offense.
I was going to go one at a time, so we can
for sure.
Things, so.
But I think that's like every team should basically always be looking to get better on both lines. You cannot go wrong. And again, like looking at I think, I was thinking about this and then I forgot that The Athletic does this every year. They did like a lessons learned from the Final Four. I was already thinking about doing this of like lessons learned from the Chiefs and the Eagles.
Smart.
And we can do a version of this on this show. I was going to do it on the radio show too, but you look at their lines and like they're incredible. They're 2 of the best offensive lines in the league. The Chiefs' strength this year was the interior of their offensive line. Obviously, they've had Chris Jones and they've done a good job filling in around him with guys like Karlaftis that have a knack for making big plays. They got a couple other guys on the defensive line that are great. And like obviously for the Chiefs, we know that like Pat is the thing that drives everything. But you look at what they've spent their money on outside of Pat, and I think the Chiefs are really instructive because the Commanders look like they have one of those dudes at quarterback. So how do you build around one of those guys? And the offensive line, making sure that guy stays upright, making sure that guy can maximize his talent. And also, can you support that guy with a run game? And that element of it, we talk about like, oh, great quarterback, need a good offensive line. Everyone's just like the health of the quarterback. And it's like, well, also, what can keep a quarterback healthy? Having him have the ability to turn around and hand the ball off 25 times a game and close out games.
Right? Look at Detroit. Like Jared Goff was a guy that was supposed to be a bridge quarterback until they drafted somebody. But you get in a group with a great offensive line, a system that supports them, and Jared Goff was like almost an MVP candidate this year, right?
Yeah.
And I would not say it's only because of the offensive line, because he deserves a ton of credit for how he played. But that offensive line is a big driver of their success. And Philly is the same thing. Like, we've talked kind of a lot about our perspective on Jalen Hurts in terms of he's not like this top flight passer, but he doesn't turn the football over. You can run the ball and you can give him, and it's one of the best pass protecting groups in the NFL. So he can hold the ball and see what he's got to see, and it covers up some of his deficiencies. So, even when you're talking about Jaden Daniels, who I think I can't overstate the year he had, right? Even when you're being hyperbolic, it's like, oh, he should have been MVP. And it's like, even though that sounds like a crazy person, like, it's actually not that crazy. So
he should finish 4th or 5th in MVP voting. And if he doesn't, it's a sham.
Right. 100%. But if you think about the things that he struggles with, it's like subtle pocket movements. It's like keeping it, you know what I mean? Like those things that, like Tom Brady and some of those other guys did such a great job of in their careers, like he can develop in that for sure. But what if we just got better on the offensive line? And that's hard to do. It's not like, oh, get better on the offense. Everyone's trying to do that. But if we're able to do that, it does limit some of his weaknesses, right? And I think if you can limit and hide some of his weaknesses and give him a couple of years to develop, like, think about where this offense could go. Think about C.J. Stroud this year. Think about the regression he had. A lot of that is tied to the offensive line and the regression that they had. So I look at that and I say to myself, like, that's why it's so important, and it's always been important. It always will be important. I do think people, there was this movement in analytics to say, oh, well, if you have the number one wide receiver, it deleverages the offensive line because you get somebody who can get open versus man-to-man coverage. You don't have to hold up as long. I understand that. But to me, if you can, and again, it's hard, like teams every year try. I think about New York and all the draft capital, the New York Giants, and all the draft capital they've invested in the offensive line, and none of it worked out. Like, there's a reason it's hard to find 5 guys who can play NFL football, and so that's where it's like, you got to hit on the pick, you got to hit on the free agent acquisition. It's got to make sure it's the right fit. You got to make sure that person develops in your scheme. But if you can get something resembling one of these top offensive lines, and I think back to Kansas City, talk about learning something from a team that's in the last little bit here, right? Their left tackle situation was a disaster this year. And this is Patrick Mahomes' worst statistical season in 5 years, right? Since his first year starting, basically. And I would say a lot of that has to do with a lack of confidence in that left tackle position. Now Mahomes is a beast; he's able to overcome it. But when, last year, for example, when that position was locked in, relatively speaking, he was outstanding. So I think that's why, to me, it's such an important part of the roster development this offseason.
Yeah, and you look at Buffalo as another great example.
Oh, great example.
They massively invested, and they kind of remade their team. They were a team that, much like Washington this year, where it's yeah, we'll let Jaden throw it 40 times. We'll let Josh throw it 40, 45 times because he's that good, and we can win a bunch of games. But they were the best version of themselves this year in a year where roster-wise they were probably down a little bit. They took some cap hits and things to try to be able to revamp for this upcoming season, and they made it to the AFC Championship game and are a couple calls and a couple inches away from going to the Super Bowl because they leaned into their running game really heavily, deleveraged Josh, made it when Josh was throwing that it was just the most effective version, and their receiving core was booty this year, all due respect. Shakir is actually a good player, and Curtis had a couple of nice moments, and Amari Cooper was good when he was there. But it's not Chase and Higgins.
Sure.
And so I think that just shows if you have a dude at quarterback, that dude can elevate your receivers, especially if you give him the O-line support. And so I think O-line, even though I would love Nick to turn into a swing piece inside. Yes, right. I would love that because that means you've got a really solid left guard. We'll see what they do at right tackle with Wiley. These guys, they're NFL caliber. They're lower end caliber NFL starters or really, really, really high end backups. They're not bad football players, but can you get better than that? And then what happens when that's the case?
Yeah, and I think that offensive line is just a really great example of what you're looking for, right? You draft an offensive guard in the second round. I forget.
Osiris
Torrance, right? Spencer Brown is a 5th round pick that was from a small school that develops. I forget if Deion Dawkins was a 1st or 2nd round pick, but again,
higher pedigree guy.
You've invested, but you've also developed guys with traits to become those starting caliber pieces. And I think that's where cultivating an offensive line is so challenging because you're not going to be able to invest 5 first-round draft picks there. You got to make sure that guys develop. And I think to this staff's credit, when you look at Andrew Wiley, I think is a great example. Talk about a guy that they were able to elevate this year, right, in terms of his production in the offensive line. So maybe you feel okay with him about starting. Obviously, Sam Cosmi gets the investment, 2nd-round pick. And then can you get a little bit more talented? Does Brandon Coleman develop? Can you get a little more talented? Again, talent is the key word here, and develop that talent and kind of become a farm for offensive linemen. And one of the things that these offensive line coaches seem to be able to do is kind of develop and cultivate those guys. We didn't even talk about Tyler Biadasz, kind of big free agent signing, but you see how they've got the bones of something. Now it's just, like you said, can you elevate, can you deleverage certain players and get more talented across that front? And I think Buffalo's offensive line is a good example of the best way to kind of construct that.
Yeah, Brady's done Joe Brady, their OC's done a good job. Also, you think of the coaches, Jeff Stoutland, the O-line coach in Philly's a beast and one of the best developers. And that's why you can take a Jordan Mailata and turn him in from a rugby player into an all-pro left tackle. Hank Fraley in Detroit, these guys are excellent. And Bobby Johnson obviously did a great job this year, and we'll see if they can continue to do that moving forward. Defensive line as well. I think getting we talked about how the interior is where it's at. They've got decisions to make on John and Duran. We can talk about that at a different day. We're kind of just talking about what they need to bring in. I do think getting a really high level edge player would be really enormous for this team. I don't know that there's one necessarily out there that they're going to be able to snag. But man, if they could figure that out, trade, whatever, like that is a position where if you just have a guy who you can rely upon to get pressure in the big situations, that is such a game changer for a defense. I think you see it around the league. Whether it's guys like Chris Jones on the inside, whether it's someone like TJ Watt on the outside, in the big moments, because think of how many big downs did not go Washington's way defensively this year, where you get to 3rd and 10 and you're just like, all right, here we go. And you're like, okay, here comes the flag on Marshawn or BSJ or the completion on Noah or whatever, because these guys, they blitz, gets hung out to dry. And I think one of the ways they were trying to do that was with Frankie. And I think Frankie had a sensational season. But I think the weakest part of his season was probably when he actually lined up as an edge player. Like a lot of his pressures and blitzes came as an off-ball linebacker, where he's just one of the best. So can you find that 3rd down edge player that more consistently can win and in the biggest spots can be trusted upon to win? That to me is high on my list as well.
Yeah, and I think that is probably, and this is something that I just want to get out there. Like, when you're a GM, I think you're always just trying to get more talent on the team. And so all of these comments and, criticisms of the team, they're not necessarily criticisms of the guys here. They did a great job in the roles that they had, but you're always trying to get better. And I think like that's ultimately what we're talking about is can you get people who are more physically dominant? Like there's a reason that, like everyone wants to move on from Logan Paulsen over the course of his career, right? It's like, was Logan Paulsen a good pro in his role? Yeah. But like, can you get better? Absolutely. And so that's more what we're talking about in the context of this. And I will say, like, for this year's draft class, like this is a great year for just freaky, big, long defensive end, defensive tackle type prospects here. So like, this is one of those things where you're talking about roster construction. You're picking at, 28? I forget, 29. Yeah. You're picking at 29 and you'll have an opportunity there to draft maybe Samar Stewart. If he's 6'6", he's 280, he's super raw, but he's a physical freak, right? Or Ivy from Ole Miss. And like, there's just a ton of defense. Like when you talk about value in the draft, there's just these guys that are very valuable because at edge, there's a lot of value there. So I think you could find people that kind of fit what you're looking for defensively. And again, just get a little bit more talented. That doesn't mean you don't want to bring Deontay Fowler back because of what he did, but maybe you can get a person that helps him have more of a pass rush specialist role and he's not playing as much as he was on 1st and 2nd down and let him really lean into his superpower, So I think that's something I would totally agree with. And again, like that's, when you think about the good teams in the league, defensive line, very good. Offensive line, very good. And there's a reason for that. Because it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the defense. And I love the distinction you pointed out there, or the observation you had there when you're like, if the defensive line's playing a little bit better, it insulates the coverage group a little bit better. Joe Wood Jr. doesn't have to blitz as much, right? We can play more conservative structures. Like that's one of the geniuses of Vic Fangio. Like everywhere he's been, like when I was in Chicago with him, the defensive front there were a bunch of absolute freaks, right? He could play a softer zone coverage behind because the front was so good. You see it in Philly, right? And you see where he struggles. He doesn't have those freaks in the front. So again, like this just makes it easier for everyone to do it. Now you got to go find that guy. You got to develop that guy. All those things have to happen. But it's one of those things that, you've definitely circled that area in a red pen and be like, how do we just get a little bit more dynamic on the offensive and defensive lines?
Then there's the back end part of it. They were very clear that Marshawn Lattimore's coming back, which is not surprising. Just there was, I think, more questions, obviously, of how the season ended. And I think there's some stuff there. I thought Kime was great on his podcast talking about how, Marshawn, the competitiveness you love, but there's an accountability that he needs to probably take that is a better fit with this locker room and the way Dan goes about his business. Like Nikki asked him about the fight with AJ Brown after the game, and he just like didn't want to talk about it. And that's not really how this team is rolled.
Sure.
And so there's an accountability piece, but he'll go through the entire offseason. He'll get that. He'll be here from day one. So that's going to be part of it. I think they would love probably to move Sanders still back inside. And then you got to figure out the other corner. There are definitely some guys in free agency. We can talk about the draft. We can talk about that stuff in a second, but that's definitely an area I think you address. Obviously, you're going to have to figure out safety opposite of Quan. That very well might be bringing Jeremy Chin back. I would be all about that. He was great. And then you got to figure out same thing with linebacker. You got Jordan McGee you drafted last year. And that's something that, as we go, we'll probably do like a rookie report podcast, maybe even next week. And some of the improvements, some of these positions that we're going to talk about, like part of the thing they need to happen is guys that were drafted last year need to step up and assume bigger roles. And like, duh, that's how drafting works.
Yeah.
Draft and develop. It's not that you are what you are day one and you come in and we know everything. But like obviously Mikey, if he can lock down that inside slot spot and then you sign someone else outside, well, there's your quarter position, you're set. If you want to bring back Bobby, I'm all for that as well, considering what he meant to this team, not only defensively, but what he meant to Jaden. Then you're starting a succession plan there. Is Jordan McGee that guy, or do you go find someone else as well? So like those are the things I think defensively. Offensively, receiver is really fascinating because you have some of both. You have a guy in Luke McCaffrey who, as a third-round pick, needs to have a bigger role next year if that pick is going to wind up being deemed successful. There's no question about that. And then you have guys like De'Ami Brown and OZ and these one-year guys that you probably, some of them you want to bring back, but you certainly also want to get a better number 2 to go opposite Terry. You now know Terry's a bona fide number 1. Yeah. Any question about that? Over. Then I like a guy like De'Ami as my next, not my number 2, but like the next guy to say, I know I can rely upon him to be a useful player in rotation. And if one of my top 2 guys goes down, I know I'm not dead in the water based off what he did in these playoffs and how he's developed. But I do think that you want to go fishing in some deeper waters there and some more expensive waters, if you will, to find a number 2, whether that is in the draft or going free agency. And it doesn't have to necessarily be T. Higgins, but there's some other guys as well.
Yeah, and it probably won't be in the draft this year because, again, there's, when you go through your draft eval, like this is probably the weakest receiver draft that I've done in a while. Like last year it was incredibly deep. There was guys that you thought, could play and contribute, and you get a guy drafted in the 5th round like Johnny Wilson who's playing significant minutes for the Philadelphia Eagles, right? Like you just get these role players throughout the NFL that are just, again, because the draft was so incredibly deep. This year is not really that way, And so what I would say is one thing that I would kind of think about here if you're a fan of the Commanders and you're a fan of football is, yes, you could go and say we need to get another dynamic receiver, but also this year's tight end class is silly in terms of pass catching tight ends, right? And this is not an indictment of Ben Sinnott. This is not an indictment of Zach Ertz, but I think in the same way with Bobby Wagner, you need to think of a succession plan. Like Ben Sinnott, I think, is going to be a good football player, but is he ever going to be what Zach Ertz is right now? I don't know, man. Like what's that Zach was, and I think fans maybe sleep on how effective Zach was this year in terms of man-to-man situations and winning consistently on third down. And think of him in the same category as like prime Jordan Reed, like just that guy that's like, this is a one-on-one, I can trust you to win. And so like is there a person in this draft that is maybe that's your number 2 player? Does that make sense what I'm saying? Like kind of the same way Kansas City's constructed where it's like Travis Kelce's your number 1. And so obviously Terry's the number 1 here, but your number 2 receiver's actually this kind of move piece tight end. And again, like I don't know if Adam would kind of go that direction, but that's something just because
that's kind of what he had in San Francisco, right? Yeah. It's like the number 1, Ayuk, I guess, but like also the number 1's kind of Kittle.
Yeah. And so finding a guy like that in terms of mismatches, and that's why the tight end position is so valuable, is because you're going to draw a good matchup. Like that's in a sport and where it's all matchup based on third down, right? Terry's going to draw the number 1 corner because that's what Terry is. But you're not going to put your number 1 corner, I hope not, on the tight end usually, right? So he's going to draw a safety or a linebacker, and that's where those guys can be so incredibly successful. So in this year's draft, there's a bunch of guys that catch the football really well. Terrence Ferguson from Oregon, Arroyo from Miami is another guy that catches the ball really well. That'll kind of be there that late first round, maybe late second.
There's like two or three guys in a lot of mock drafts going in the top 20.
Yeah, and so like, Warren from Penn State's a beast. Loveland from Michigan is a beast.
Yeah.
And I think those guys will be long gone by the time the Commanders are picking, which is a good problem to have. You're winning football games. But there are other guys later in this draft class. Harold Fannin from Bowling Green, very unique in terms of body type and movement skills, but caught 117 balls last year, in college. So there are guys that you say, maybe it's not receiver because it's kind of a weak receiver class, but maybe it's one of these tight ends. And that's where I think with the receiver thing, if you really say we need a true number 2, like if you're a Commanders fan, make sure you're checking out that free agency list hard and saying not who the best player is, but maybe who the best fit is for what Cliff Kingsbury wants to do.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, and by the way, receivers, you got T. Higgins, who's going to probably reset the market, period, because he's going to be a true free agent and be out there to get paid. I mean, Chris Godwin, I doubt he gets out of Tampa, but oh my God, am I interested in Chris Godwin?
Dude, I know he's coming off the injury, but that's the one, every time I look at the list, I'm like, he would be perfect.
He would be incredible.
If he's healthy.
Amari Cooper's older, but he's on the list. There's quite a number of guys, obviously. I'm not really interested in Stephon Diggs, but he's available. But there are some guys out there. Darius Slayton, I think, is a really interesting sleeper from New York because he's got real speed. And that's something that I think showed with Diami this year, the power of true team speed in this offense. So that's something to watch as well. And obviously, as we said, the thing that kind of needs to happen, no matter what, no matter how you attack the acquisitions, is Luke needs to take a step next year.
Yeah.
And
Ben needs to take a step. They all need to take a step forward. Yeah.
For sure. And that's just, again, that's not a shot at what those guys did as rookies or saying that they're busts or anything. And it drives me nuts when people try to say that. And I'm like, no. They're young players. It's hard to play as a rookie in the NFL. But if they develop over time, those can be really good picks still. And next year, obviously, they need to take that first big leap and get a lot more minutes, a lot more snaps. The other thing on offense, as we kind of tuck tight end in there, is the running back position.
Yeah.
And obviously Eckler was pretty sensational. B-Rob had some really nice moments this year, but I'm very curious to see how they attack this position because I think we see obviously the impact that a really, really great running back can have. And there just aren't a lot of them that are worth that, right? This isn't some rebirth of the running back position. It's just, I think, a recalibration of the market of if Saquon's worth paying, Derrick Henry's worth paying, the Christian McCaffrey's worth paying because those guys can be the engines of an offense. And obviously Ashton Genty's in the draft, although I saw Bucky Brooks had him going 12th to Dallas. He's probably long gone by the time Washington gets on the board. But I think that how they attack that position is super interesting to me. I don't know what the right move is. I haven't gotten deep enough in the class either way yet, but it is something to watch of do they try to attack that position to try to give Jaden some more help in the backfield and build a more potent and explosive running game in 2025.
Yeah, and again, like we just talked about with Saquon, while the runner is important, the offensive line is equally as important there. So that's where it's you get good offensive line talent, you improve the offensive line, whether it's through scheme or personnel, and you get an elevation not only of the quarterback, but also of the runner. And if I was going to put money on something this offseason, I would put a lot of money that they're going to draft a running back. It's not going to probably be in the first 2 rounds. It's probably going to be in the 3rd round. And this isn't a knock on B-Rob or Austin Eckler. This is more of a testament to just how damn good this running back class is. It's silly. There's kind of like the receiver class last year where you're like, this dude's really good. You're just watching back. You're like, this dude's really good. This dude's big and he's strong and he's breaking tackles. This guy's good in protection. This guy can catch the football. This guy's got receivers.
And we see it all the time with rookie running backs. Think of Bucky Irving this year, 3rd round pick. And everyone knew he was good.
Yeah.
And it's oh yeah, but he's a running back. So he gets drafted in the 3rd round and then he's a 1,000-yard rusher and changes the Bucs' whole season.
Yeah, and so I would say there's a couple guys that are really good. Ashton Genty, the kid from North Carolina, I think his last name is Hampton. Those guys are kind of in their own bucket, but the next guys, that next tier is really impressive in terms of you can get a big guy, you can get a small guy, you get a scat back, you can get a converted wide receiver. It's all kind of in there. So I would say if I was putting money on it, they're picking somebody, and they might pick 2 just because it's so deep. And so this is also where free agent decisions or offseason decisions, are often reflect the market. So if it's a strong free agent, wide receiver group, you're probably going to pick up a receiver from that group, right? If it's a strong in the draft, because the receiver class is so weak in the draft this year, it's free agency, right? Running back is so strong in the draft this year. You're probably going to draft a run. It's just like you're probably going to draft a defensive lineman. You might draft a tight end just because those positions are so strong this year. And are they the greatest positions of value? No, but I do think that it kind of just because the value is so good there, you're probably going to go in that direction.
For sure. And so we've kind of done, as we've gone here, the thing that we were going to do at the end, which is take a look. No, it's all right. I almost did it this way on purpose. Instead, we did it this way on accident. So it's fine. You got to roll with the punches sometimes, Logan. You got to be adaptable here in these podcasting streets. We talked about the contours of these draft classes. So just real quick to kind of put a bow on that. Scrolling through ESPN, for instance, they just put out, Matt Bowen put out a top 50. Like, there's a lot of DBs in this top 50. There's quite a few offensive linemen in this top 50. Obviously, at the top of it is T. Higgins. So you have a couple of wide receivers that we mentioned. But you also have, I think, some interesting guys. I mean, the number 2 free agent on this list is a guy that's number 1 on a lot of boards, and it is a guy that I would consider spending money on. Trey Smith from Kansas City is a free agent. They're guard.
Really?
He's 26 years old. Like, he had a heck of a season. I think like Ryan Poles, who was in Kansas City when they drafted him, like Chicago's a team to watch out for here, but like there are some good younger players that are out there at positions that are interesting. DJ Reed, corner, who's 28 from the Jets. Like, he's interesting. Obviously, Godwin, we mentioned. Khalil Mack, like, do you want to go the super veteran route and pick off a couple of those? Like Charvarius Ward from who's 29 at corner from San Francisco, but he obviously was with Adam in San Francisco. Josh Sweat's 28, and he's going to be a free agent from Philly. I think a big one to watch, for obvious reasons, Odigizua from Dallas, the defensive tackle. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about a penetrating defensive tackle who knows how to thrive in Dan Quinn's system. So there's a lot of really interesting free agents. And again, the Commanders have a ton of space, and then they don't need to pay their own outside of giving Terry an extension, and their quarterback's going to be cheap as hell for the next 4 years. So I think that's really interesting to watch. I think a guy, or like, what do they do in terms of Sam Cosmi? Is he going to be ready for camp? If not, are you interested in like a Zach Martin on a 1-year deal? He's a free agent from Dallas. So I think that there's a lot of really interesting, both younger veteran options and older veteran options, guys like Martin, Mack, who could be leaders and are going to be looking to chase a ring, but could also help lay the foundation. And I think of what Jaden Daniels wrote on the jersey he signed for Bobby Wagner, Logan. I don't know if you saw this.
No.
But on locker cleanout day, Jaden signed a jersey for Bobby, and he said, "You set the standard forever."
Oh, wow.
And I think of those kinds of guys that Dan was pretty explicit in saying, like, we're going to have those guys always in our locker room. So there's a lot of options here in the free agent class. And then, you can talk a little bit more about the contour of the draft class, some positions that are strong, weak, et cetera.
Yeah, well, I think it's good. And I think the thing that I'm always thinking about with free agency is like top flight wide receivers really hit the market. So seeing T. Higgins on there is enticing. But again,
and Chris Godwin, by the way, is a second guy. If he even gets there, we'll see if Tampa lets him out of the building by the time free agency actually opens.
Yeah, correct. And then elite offensive linemen usually don't hit the market in free agency. So when you look at those, like, and again, like, it's kind of not great, but the receiver class is very weak in this class, and the offensive line class is kind of weak in the draft this year. And there are guys with talent, and I think that's where it makes me optimistic, right? There's talented guys on the offensive line, but they're either from a small school, they're really raw, they haven't played a lot. There's a couple things they got to work on in terms of cleaning up their game. So if you're willing to maybe take a guy late in the second round and say, we're going to develop you and get you right, kind of like you did with Brandon Coleman this year, I think you might be in a decent spot. So like, just to give you that kind of contour. So some of the other things we talked about, like if I was going to say what are the best positions in this class, definitely defensive line. So if I'm Dan Quinn, I may not be looking at that defensive line list that closely. Obviously, Odigizua, but anytime you can get bigger, stronger, faster in that group, like this is a great year to do it in the draft. Again, with guys that maybe are a little bit raw, a little bit developmental, but have the physical traits that make you kind of jump out of your seat and say, I want you to be a Washington Commander, right? You mentioned tight ends, like that's one that I think is so interesting because the tight end group is so talented from a pass catching standpoint, but you just drafted Ben Sinnott, right? So like, do you say, hey, we're going to ride with Ben see if he develops. It just seems like such a big jump for him to be Zach Ertz in 2 years. And we've seen crazier things, but that's one where I'm like, maybe. And then running back, like we just talked about, is interesting. And then DB. I think DB is a fun one this year. There are some guys that are really talented. And so when you talk about getting a little bit more depth, maybe a starting caliber player on the perimeter, moving Mike inside, there are some guys here that I think are kind of, again, like there's a DB from Florida State. I'm still learning how to say his name. It's like Araya. It's like got like a Y and an apostrophe H at the end.
Dane Brugler. I know the beast doesn't come out for like 2 months, but can we at least get the pronunciation guide?
We got to get that one going. So, but he's a man corner from Florida State who's big, he's long, kind of fits what Dan wants to do. He led the team in tackles last year. He was second team in tackles. We'll talk about like the way the Commanders get down on the perimeter. Like he seems like an interesting guy. I don't know if he's a first round pick or early second round pick, but a guy that would make your football team significantly better. So there are pieces there. It just, again, like this is so hard to do because I think we're still getting a feel, you and I both, for like with Ron, it was very clear, like the way Ron spoke about stuff, you can kind of get a direction for what he was thinking for the offseason. Adam, to his credit, is a little bit more, I don't know if guarded's the word. He's just like, he's not going to share information.
He doesn't say anything at the podium, man. It's brutal for us, but also like I get it. And what am I going to do? Complain about it that he's doing a good job?
That you're doing what a GM's supposed to do, which is say something without saying anything. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. Like, hey, we're really excited about these opportunities, and then you're like, okay, cool, but like, what are you guys thinking about this offseason? And so we don't really know yet, but those are kind of our gut inclinations. And based on the free agent class and based on the draft class, you kind of say this is the direction I think they would go in each area. But again, that can change dramatically if they sign someone in free agency or I guess they could also trade for somebody too. Like there's
I was going to say that is something to look out for, especially if there is I'm going to call it a distressed asset that's out there. That is kind of the Adam Peters special, right?
Yeah.
In San Francisco was, how do you get an elite offensive lineman? You trade for Trent Williams because he wants the hell out of Washington, and you get a Hall of Famer for a third round pick. So like that kind of stuff is, I think, worth watching. And
what about the Tyreek Hill thing that he kind of wants out of Miami? And again, like that's there.
I'm out specifically on Tyreek, but like that's the kind of thing.
That's kind of what I'm saying. Like
you look for, like Andrew Berry is saying that Myles Garrett's not going anywhere in Cleveland. If Myles Garrett wants out of Cleveland, Myles Garrett's going to get out of Cleveland. And like I would give up 29. I would give up my first round pick for Myles Garrett and wouldn't think twice about it.
Oh, so are you kidding? Yeah, they're not going to let him get out of there.
It's probably going to take that and next year's.
Yeah.
So like, Myles Garrett's going to be hard to get, but I would give up a lot for Myles Garrett because he's Myles freaking Garrett. But like those are the kinds of players that if you can figure out how to get that quote unquote distressed asset in a trade, it's definitely worth it, and I think it's probably more worth it in considering you're picking at the end of the rounds.
Sure.
It's also worth remembering too, as we were talking about like the running back stuff in that kind of third round area. Washington does not have its own third rounder; it has Miami's, courtesy of the Jahan Dotson trade. So they'll pick earlier in that round, but they gave up their own third in the Marshawn trade.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and if you can find something like that, that'd be fantastic. It's just it would be fantastic. Like really, that would be kind of the big move that you're looking for in terms of getting a piece that can really help you right now. But again, that's hard to do because teams don't want to let those types of guys go.
No, that for sure. And there are less and less. I was going to try to be nicer, but I can't think of a better word. There are less and less dumb front offices in the NFL. You got a lot of smart people in a lot of places. And, there's certainly some GMs that still you're like, how do you operate? And you can rip them off, but that it is fewer and farther between as folks like Adam Peters, who are super duper smart, are infiltrating front offices around the NFL. All right, that is our show for today. That is our shows for this week. We'll be back next week. I think two things for next week, Logan, unless we come up with a better idea. But I think we should do a mailbag. and answer listener questions going into the offseason. So I've already gotten a couple that are good, but you can hit me on Instagram at hoffman.sports. You can at Logan_Paulsen82. You can also send me an email, hoffmanshow.com. Use the contact link, and you can drop your questions there. I guess technically you can leave it on Blue Sky too, but try to Instagram and email is my preferred mailbag dumping grounds, because then I don't have to go searching in a million places for the questions. So let us know what you want to know going into the offseason. And then I think a rookie report, looking back on the first Adam Peters draft class, how it performed. I wonder if Jaden Daniels is going to get a passing grade. You think once we review that in a little more depth that he
come on, don't spoil it. Yeah.
Hang out for that next week, boys and girls. Hold on to your seats. So we'll do that next week. In the meantime, Logan, enjoy the rest of your time in Mobile.
Thank you.
We'll review some of that on the show as well. Maybe we'll start before we get to the mailbag questions with a little Mobile recap on Monday or Tuesday, whenever we do the show next week. I don't know what's a day anymore. That's Logan. I'm Craig. I don't know what day it is, but I do know this podcast is over. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.